In this video, we're going to be looking at sampling techniques. Now, it's really important to note that this word sampling we've actually come across before in the research methods topic. So we've come across sampling when we've looked at observations and observational techniques. And here, when we refer to it in this context, we're really talking about how we record behaviour. And I hope that the terms event and time sampling are familiar to you. In this video, and in this particular area of the specification, we're talking about the sampling of participants. We're talking about how we select our participants from the population using various techniques, and the issues that these might cause in terms of bias and our ability to generalize our findings. So, really important that we are clear on the vocabulary here. Researchers don't include everybody from the target population in their study. It's typically too costly, too time-consuming, and actually is usually unnecessary. When we're talking about that population, we're talking about the group of people that the researcher is interested in studying. And it's often just very, very difficult to get your hands on all of those participants. And so we typically just study a smaller subset of the population. An example of a population could be A-level psychology students. A population could be A-level psychology students at Caterham. An example could be men over 50, etc. So the population is the entire group of people that you're interested in studying. But we typically don't include every single person from our population to be included in our study because it's just too time consuming and we don't actually need it. What we want, however, is to be able to make generalizations about this population. And we do this by selecting a sample using a particular sampling technique that we hope is a representative sample. So this set or selection of participants that we've selected to include in our study represent our population on really important characteristics. And if they represent our population on these characteristics, then it generally means generalizations can be made. If our sample is too small or if it is not representative, then we're unlikely to be able to generalize our findings. So getting a representative sample is not as easy as it sounds, and we're going to be looking at the different techniques to do that in just a moment. So what do we mean by a representative sample? A representative sample is a sample or a subset of the population that is similar to the population in terms of relevant characteristics. If our smaller subset of our population represents our population well, it means we can generalize our findings. We don't always end up with a representative sample. Sometimes the people who we select to participate in our research actually don't have the same characteristics as most of the members of the population. And in which case, we end up with a biased sample. And it means that we're going to have difficulty generalizing our findings to that population. So let's just have a look at what this looks like with a nice diagram here. So when we're talking about the population, this is the entire group of people the researcher is interested in studying. So let's take here A-level pupils. At Caterham. So this is the entire subset here. We're talking about approximately 300 pupils or so. And for us, for our time constraints and our money constraints, we just can't assess all 300 pupils. So we're going to have to create a sample. So our sample consists of the participants who have been selected from our population and are participating in our research. The people who are participating in our research are known as our participants. Ideally, this sample and the participants in this sample are going to share the same characteristics as our population. If they reflect our population quite well, then what is true for the sample will be true for the population, which means that we can generalize our findings from this sample to the population. So, take our example here of A-level pupils at Caterham. What we don't want is for all of our A-level pupils to just be the mathematicians. We don't want our sample and our participants to just contain the boys in A-level, studying A-level at Caterham. What we want is to make sure that our sample is representative. We want to make sure that we've got a good representation of both boys and girls. We want to make sure that all of the subjects are represented as well. And ideally, we want to make sure that the subjects are represented in the same proportions that they occur in the population. That will allow us to make generalizations. If a finding is true for our sample and our sample represents our population, then we can generalize. As we go through the different sampling techniques, we're going to be using this N. N refers to our sample. Strictly, it's the number of participants. So this is just going to be helpful going forward. Okay, so we're going to be looking at 5 sampling techniques. Now, we're just going to be looking at AO1 in this video. There's an AO3 task for you to complete for homework, and we're going to be doing lots of application in class. So we're just covering the facts today, but you will also need to know in time the strengths and limitations of this technique, and you'll need to be able to contextualize those strengths and limitations. So for example, in study A, a novel study, why is X sampling technique better than Y? So you need to be able to really contextualize it. Rather than just giving vague and generic strengths and limitations, you need to say why, for one particular study, that's a limited sampling technique that's going to create bias, and you need to be able to identify what that bias might be. So let's make a start then. All right, we're going to start with random sampling. I'd say this is the most common method that psychologists use to select participants for research. Random sampling occurs when every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So every single person has an equal chance of taking part in the research. There are 2 main ways that we do this. I think pulling the name out of a hat is the most common method. Although, as we know in psychological research, we typically want to use numbers rather than participants' names to adhere to confidentiality. If you have a big enough sample, if you select enough participants, then it's likely, although not guaranteed, but likely that your population is going to be representative, and therefore you can make generalizations. So if we just go back a moment to this diagram here, if we've got 300 pupils in our population, we want to make sure that every single one of those pupils has an equal chance of being selected. So we'll go through the process of a random sample in just a moment, but provided it's all done completely randomly and no one person has a greater chance of participating than another. And provided our sample is big enough, so I guess if we had 10 people, it's unlikely to be representative. So provided it's random, and provided our sample is large enough, it's likely that we'll be able to make generalizations. So let's have a look now at the process of random sampling. We've split it up into 4 points. Some of these seem very common sense. They seem a little bit redundant perhaps, but you need to have every single one of them in order to get full marks in a question in an exam. These are typically 4-mark questions, and you need to hit all 4 points to get full marks. So our first step is that every member of the population is allocated a number. So in the case of the A-level students, we're allocating our students a number between 1 and 300. In more general terms, in fact, scratch that. So our population, depending on the population size, every person is allocated a number, the size of our population. Then our next step, we put all of our numbers into a hat or in a container. So we put all 300 into a box there. We then randomly select n numbers out of the hat. N is the number in our sample, i.e. the number of participants that we need. For example, we might want 30 participants. So we put all 300 names in the hat and we randomly draw out 30 names. And these 30 numbers, these 30 numbers that are drawn out correspond then to the participants that are going to take part in the research. So 4 steps for random sampling there. Okie doke. Let's move on now to look at systematic sampling. A systematic sample is chosen by selecting every nth person from the population. N is going to depend on your population size and your sample size. It differs from random sampling because not everybody in our population has an equal chance of being selected for participation in the research. And we'll see why in just a tick. So let's have a look at this example. So how do you actually go about selecting a systematic sample? In order to determine what we mean by every nth person, in order to calculate n, we need to divide our population by our sample. So in the case above, we had 300 A-level pupils, and we wanted a sample of 30. In that case, n equals 10, which means we're going to select every 10th person from some sort of list. So we're going to get the list of all 300 A-level pupils from a class register, for example, or from Mr. Bailey's exam list, and we're going to select every 10th person. And so on and so forth. Ideally, we want this list to be randomized. That's our first step. That's not always the case, however. That's not a necessary part of systematic sampling. It's just important if you want to get it right. So another example here. So a sixth form has 120 pupils, and we would like to form a focus group of 12. So we're going to take our population and divide it by our sample to determine n. We're then going to get our sixth form register, our list. Ideally, this is randomized, and we're going to select every 10th pupil from that list. Okay, let's look now at stratified sampling. A hefty definition, but in just a moment I'll show you an image that I hope will break this down for you. So, a stratified sample is where the researcher divides, or what we call stratifies, the target population into subgroups or strata. So basically we're taking the population and we're breaking them down into different subgroups according to their frequency in the population. So let's start there. Here is our population. In our population we have 12 participants, 12 people. Not participants yet. And as we can see, we've been able to break them down into smaller subgroups or strata. Here we've got a subgroup of people who wear blue shirts. We've got a subgroup of people who wear green, pink, and red. And we can see here the proportions of these subgroups that occur in the population. So blue shirts make up 25% of the population, green 25, pink 25, and red also 25. What we want to get in our sample is a selection of participants from each strata or each subgroup, and we want them in the same proportion as they occur in the population. So in our sample, we want to make sure that we also have 25% of blue shirts, 25% green shirts, 25% pink shirts, and 25% red shirts. So we need to make sure that our sample contains the subgroups of our population in the same proportion to that which occur in the population. When we're actually selecting these people, we do so randomly. So we're going to select these blue people randomly, i.e., each one of these people has an equal chance of being selected. And we do this just using the same method we would for random sampling. For example, we allocate them a number, we put the numbers in the hat, and we select one out at random. Likewise for green, we put all of the green people, we give them a number, we put their numbers in a hat, and then we randomly select one out. So let's just go back to our definition. Stratified sampling, the researcher stratifies the target population into strata by calculating the frequency that that subgroup occurs in the population. We then randomly select those participants from those subgroups in the same proportions so that the sample is representative. Let's have another look at an example now. So let's take students studying psychology at Caterham School. This is our population. And our sample is going to be 12. In our population of A-level psychology students at Caterham School, we can see that we've got two subgroups. We've got females and males. And we can see the proportions at which those subgroups occur. We can see that we have 75% female and 25% male. So it means in our sample of 12, we want to make sure that in that we have 75% female and 25% male. So this is how we do that. We take 75% or 0.75 times n times 12. We end up with 9 females, and 25% times 12 is 3 males. 9 plus 3 equals 12. So in our sample of 12 pupils, we have 9 girls and 3 boys. And we can see in that case that our sample represents our population. We've got the same proportion of participants from each subgroup in our sample as occur in the population, which means it's likely that we're going to be able to generalize. So, what are the steps involved in actually obtaining a stratified sample? Well, first, you need to identify your subgroups in the population. Maybe this is boys and girls. Maybe this is subject studied, maths, psych, bio, etc. Maybe this is ages, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds. So we identify our subgroups. We then need to calculate the proportion of our subgroups. So we need to identify what percentage is girls, what percentage is boys, what percentage 16-year-olds do we have, 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds, so that we know the proportions from our population. We then need to make sure that those proportions are calculated for our sample. So in the case of the boys versus girls, once we know our sample size, we can times our proportion of our first subgroup by n, the percentage of our second subgroup by n, and that will tell us how many participants from each subgroup we need in our sample. It's very rare that you actually need to calculate the proportions of participants that you're going to need, but it's important that you understand the process. So we've identified the subgroups in our population. We've identified the proportions they occur in the population and been able to then calculate the proportions we need and the numbers we need for our sample. We're then going to use some sort of random sampling method. So, for example, the number in a hat method. So we give all of the people in subgroup 1 a number between 1 and whatever number we need of that subgroup in our sample. We give everybody in our second subgroup a number between 1 and whatever number of participants we need from that subgroup in our sample, etc. We then select out that number of participants so that our sample contains participants in the same proportion as the population. We're going to do plenty of work calculating this in lessons this week. Do not worry too much about this step. These are the general steps that are most important for your 4 marks. Okay, 2 more to go. Opportunity sampling is exactly as the name suggests. This is where we're using participants who are accessible and willing to take part. They're basically convenient. You know, the opportunity is there for them to take part. So it's really just using whoever is there and happy to participate. So it could be the first 20 students who arrive at school that day. It could be shoppers who happen to be at that shopping mall on the day that the researchers are there. It's basically whoever is convenient and willing to participate. It's not random, because not everybody in the population has an opportunity to take part. What if you were busy that day and so you didn't make it into school on time? What happens if you shop at a different shopping centre? You do not have any chance of participating in that research, so it's not random. And this can produce, therefore, a biased sample. In the case of volunteer sampling, our final sampling technique, unsurprisingly, these are people who have volunteered to take part. So these are people who have typically responded to an advertisement. Maybe that's in a newsletter, maybe that is in the university department's corridor asking for volunteers. But it's people who have seen an ad and responded to it. So they've put their hand up and volunteered to take part. So some examples that we've come across was Hazan and Shaver's research with the love quiz. So this was a quiz that was put in the newspaper, and then they analysed the first 620 volunteers to send back their answers. Another example could be people who respond to an email asking for a review of a product. It's just the ones that offer their time to participate, those that are willing to take part and have put their hand up and have volunteered to do so. What typically happens is that we end up here with some sort of volunteer bias. The types of people that are going to volunteer for a particular study might all share some unique characteristic that is not shared in the population. For example, in Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment, we had volunteers who were responding to a study about prison life. We have to question, really, why did particular participants become interested in that study? Why were they attracted to that study, and why were they willing to take part? Is it because people who are interested in understanding prison life are interested in that hostile environment? Maybe these are people who have idealized visions of prisons. Maybe they've watched lots of prison films. In any case, they might share a characteristic that is not seen in the population. And for that reason, we might end up with a biased sample, known as a volunteer bias. Another example could be in the one that I gave earlier about asking for product reviews. If people volunteer to give a review for a product or a brand, you're likely to get different ends of the spectrum. People who are going to give up their time to write a review are going to be those that either absolutely loved the product and are raving about it, and those who absolutely hate the product and it broke the first time they used it. So again, we're likely to end up with some sort of bias. We have to really question, why are these people taking time out to take part in this? What's their motive? What's their interest? What are the characteristics that they might have, which has drawn them to this study, which might not be shared by the population? And therefore, to what extent can we generalize from a volunteer sample to the population? So, really important that you understand for each of these sampling techniques what it is by definition and how we obtain it. In the lessons to come, we're going to be looking at doing a bit of practice with these. And so you'll have a bit more practice at how we actually obtain the samples. And from that, you should then be able to also identify the strengths and weaknesses of the different sampling methods as well. So that's it.